Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about the criticism that Objectivism receives. And Objectivism, for those of you who do not know, is a philosophy created by the Russian philosopher Ayn Rand. Recently, I have seen a lot of people try to argue against Objectivism or criticize Atlas Shrugged, and their arguments and criticisms have just been hilariously inaccurate. I've yet to see a decent argument. Everyone who attempts to argue against Objectivism does so with ridiculous amounts of misinterpretation. So this video will address why, and I'll give a few examples at the end. I think the primary reason why so many people who try to criticize Ayn Rand's work have such a difficult time doing so, and absolutely fail at understanding even the most basic of principles of Objectivism, is because, quite simply, they haven't read any of Ayn Rand's work. Maybe they claim to have read Atlas Shrugged, and maybe they've read parts of it, but certainly not the entire book or any of the speeches. I even had an English teacher who, and I kid you not, said that Peter Keating was the hero of the Fountainhead, and she's an English teacher, so it's just hilarious. And I've met other people who've made similar cases with Atlas Shrugged, except they thought the main protagonist was James Taggart, or more commonly Eddie Willers, which is pretty bad, but they weren't English teachers or even English majors. So anyways, I can somewhat empathize with people who haven't read Atlas Shrugged or who don't want to read it. It's Rand's most famous work and recommended by everyone. However, it's roughly 1,080 pages of very, very tiny text. And if you don't have any interest in the subject matter, which in the beginning of the book, or the beginning of Atlas Shrugged, the story focuses on a woman, Dagny Taggart, and a man, Hank Rearden, and their struggle to run their businesses in a sea of incompetence and regulation. However, later on, the book becomes a little bit more complex as an entire cast of brilliant minds begin their fight against an encroaching darkness that threatens to douse the entire world, killing even the brightest of cities like New York. However, about the first 300 pages pretty much focus on Dagny's relationship with Hank Rearden and their struggle to start this controversial train line known as the John Galt Line. And if you don't really have like an interest in the subject matter, as I said, I can really see and understand the reader having a difficult time making it through the entire book. I think the first time I read the book, it took me like a year to actually finish it. And I loved Hank Rearden and Dagny. They were really cool characters, but I wasn't really interested in the story up until Francisco played a little bit more of a pivotal role. And also a little bit of a background about me. Before I was an objectivist, I was very hardcore liberal. But not like most liberals today who try to mask their socialism and name it as something else. I pretty much embraced socialism explicitly. And even after I finished Atlas Shrugged, I didn't really consider myself an objectivist. But by the time I read Galt's speech, I was convinced of various premises that I hadn't agreed with beforehand. And then after Galt's speech, I really began to question my own philosophy. However, I didn't like the idea of ascribing to someone else's philosophy. I always thought that philosophy was for an individual to create, and then following someone else's way of living was somehow less human, which is absolutely hilarious since I was a firm believer in regulation and total damnation of the wealthy, this was before I read Atlas Shrugged, and really before I read Francisco's money speech. By the time Francisco gave his money speech, I was pretty convinced of capitalism and that everything I knew about money beforehand was just wrong. Anyways, so it wasn't until I read The Romantic Manifesto, which was the second book I read by Ayn Rand and also a piece of her nonfiction, that I really considered myself an objectivist, or really wanted to be an objectivist. I actually like Ayn Rand's essays more than I like her fiction. Not saying that I don't love her fiction, it's just I personally like reading essays better. I feel you get more information faster. And so anyways, if you want a good book to read without having to read Atlas Shrugged and get an introduction of Objectivism, I recommend For the New Intellectual. It's a really short book, about 216 pages, contains the most important speeches from her fiction and also a nice introduction. And so if you're new to Objectivism and want like an introduction, or if you want to start an argument or criticize Objectivism, I highly recommend For the New Intellectual. So now getting down to the point of this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the critiques of Objectivism. And these are just a couple of criticisms from some of the more popular anti-objectivists. First off, Anne Heller, who wrote a book called Ayn Rand and the World She Created, criticized Ayn Rand as an original thinker with the last too little education in the history of philosophy. Yet Ayn Rand's background is that she was a philosopher and a history major. And so if you've read Philosophy Who Needs It, or the opening for The New Intellectual, or Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, or pretty much any of her nonfiction, Rand really demonstrates a profound grasp of past philosophers. In her fiction, she creates characters that follow various philosophies to a T. So for someone to make the claim that Ayn Rand has too little education in the history of philosophy, is just stupid. I mean, it really needs some kind of proof. And the thing that I notice about all these criticisms is they all lack evidence. Like, none of them have anything Ayn Rand actually said. And so the thing is Ayn Rand quotes philosophers verbatim. So if you're going to criticize something, it would have to be Ayn Rand's analysis of those philosophers, which good luck with that, but I would genuinely love to see someone attempt an actual critique. That way I would feel like I have something new to talk about or discuss, as opposed to having to constantly define selfishness or constantly explain why in a capitalist society murdering your neighbor or competition is wrong. Things that are so basic that I wouldn't ever have to bother arguing with on a daily basis if people would just read Rand's work. And I don't mind explaining the basic fundamentals of objectivism to people who are interested, but to have to say the same thing to critics, like the people who have claimed to have read Ayn Rand's work and have developed a logical reason why they reject the philosophy and why they parallel it with that of a serial murderer's philosophy, just gets really old. They should know these basic fundamentals. Um, and again, another Heller quote, which also kind of sums up what most people say about Ayn Rand or objectivists without actually knowing anything about objectivism or Ayn Rand herself. Heller says, quote, Ayn Rand imposed such a weird rigor on herself and others as to leave her dark and alone at the end, end quote. And this is just ad hominem garbage. Ayn Rand was married and she had a circle of close friends. I mean, her philosophy stresses a creed of happiness. If I think if you meet most objectivists, we all lead really busy lives, and we all have really fulfilling lives because we live by a philosophy that really stresses achievement and enjoyment of every second of your life. And so to kind of wrap this video up, if I have time, I got a few minutes, I thought I'd end with a Greg Nyquist quote or critique of Ayn Rand's Attila. And just so first off, Attila is an archetype introduced in Ayn Rand's nonfiction piece for the New Intellectual, described as, quote, the man who lives by brute force, at the whim and mercy of the moment, lives on a narrow island suspended in a fog of the unknown, where invisible threats and unpredictable disasters can descend upon him any morning. He is willing to surrender his consciousness to the man who offers him protection against those intangible questions which he does not wish to consider yet dreads, end quote. Then Nyquist says, quote, her description of this archetype strikes one as hopelessly distorted caricature, a product not of honest reflection of the facts of history, but of mere wishful thinking and moral indignation, end quote. And I really wonder if Nyquist has ever heard of the SS. I mean, I really couldn't think of a better example for Attila. I mean, these men lived by the gun. They followed Hitler just without question. They thought he was just had divine power, and they existed in history. And they're just one example upon many. And of course, Nyquist fails to mention the archetype, the witch doctor. How the witch doctor and Attila are symbiotic in relationship. And the witch doctor's job is to turn morality into a weapon of enslavement, to divorce it from man's reason and from the goals of his own existence. It's Attila's job to conquer men physically, but the witch doctor's job to conquer them mentally, prepping them to willingly give up their motivation for seeking a life here on earth and having them trust that they will just be rewarded after life. And this is how the majority of the societies were run throughout the course of human history. I mean, Attila and the witch doctor ran the world. They owned man. And hell, I challenge anyone to prove to me that the majority of the religious world isn't still run by the Attila and the witch doctor to